Hey everyone, welcome to week 54. This is day 5. This is our final day of our water mixable oil paint week. And I'm gonna be honest, I don't know if these paints are going to be able to fully replace my traditional oil paints, but I like them. I mean, they are different. I think the purpose is not to say, yeah, they feel exactly the same, and you can dilute them with water. No. You have to make some concessions so that kind of emulsion can work. But I like it. I think it's something that I'm going to revisit in the future. And probably what I'm going to try to do is use some of the mediums that they sell for this paint and try to mix it also with regular, more traditional mediums that I use with my oil paints. Because in theory, both of those work. So we'll see how we do today and how we finish off this week. Remember, next week, whole new theme or maybe another really cool conversation. We'll see.
Okay, let's get started. This is Friday. This is our last day of our water mixable oil paints. I always say this when I'm working on a technique that I don't usually use. Particularly these paints. This is the first time I've ever painted with these paints. That's not quite true for the other weeks. When I've painted with gouache, I already had some experience with gouache, even if it was very, very little experience. But I knew what to expect with gouache. And even though I always think it's an uphill battle every time I set up my gouache paints or Danny's gouache set, like I did on the last week that I used gouache paints, it is weird, it is strange, only because it is very different from oil paints. But I can understand it. I can feel like even though I offer some resistance to it, that's probably my pride in being an oil painter. It's a dumb pride, to be honest. But I kind of know what to expect, and I give in, and I try to make the best out of it. Do I understand myself as a gouache painter? Probably not. I would need months and months and months of painting with gouache paints to really, really comprehend them as paints, to forge a relationship with them and see myself as someone who can think through gouache paint. I think that that's the most important part of it. It's not just about making a painting. Let's say if I was using gouache and just making a nice gouache painting, that's not the end goal, I feel, at least not for me. I think that that's very possible with any medium. You brute force your way in and make a nice painting. But when you encounter people that have complete empathy with a medium, it doesn't mean that they have to do just that for the rest of their lives, but you realize that they have a really deep connection with that particular medium, with those paints, with that manner of working. You then see that there's a huge precipice between, in my case, me brute forcing my way through using gouache and somebody who truly understands how to use gouache paint. I wish I could say that I can think of many, many people that are capable of using different mediums in a highly proficient manner, but that's probably not true. I don't think that that's the norm. I think that that's the exception. Right now, I can think of Nick Alm using watercolors and oil paints in just masterful ways. I mean, he has one of the highest abilities I've ever seen in painting, and it makes sense. He's Swedish. He's just drinking some of that Zorn water. So like Zorn, he is capable of doing something truly special with both watercolor and oil paint. And the other person I can think of, and I mean, I'm sure there's tons of people that are very, very capable with a ton of manners of painting. But, James Gurney, I feel that James Gurney can grab some acrylic paint and do a wonderful acrylic painting. He could grab some casein paint and do an incredible casein painting. He could grab a gouache and do amazing gouache, watercolor and do the same, and oil paint and do fantastic. He has, and I still really believe this, he has the heart of those golden age illustrators. He's like a true illustrator at heart. I'm not saying that people nowadays are not illustrators just because they can't, sculpt and paint in a myriad of ways like James does. But he is special that way. I don't think he sees any of these, manners and techniques as foreign. He has that ability to adjust and to understand them wholly as mediums and express through them wonderfully. Both James Gurney and Nick Alm, those are special people. I think that we can call them extraordinary people because that's not something that happens quite often. What I tend to do when I introduce a new medium is try to very quickly understand how it differs from the one medium that I feel most comfortable with, which is oil paint. I think that that's the most important first step. By comparison and by relating it to something that you understand closely, you can then gauge the inherent value to that manner of working. So when I want to work with gouache paint, or like this week when I want to work with water mixable oil paints, my initial reaction is to say, okay, how does this compare to traditional oils? Not because I hold traditional oils in a pedestal, although I think I do, and I think that that's what's stopping me from really, really enjoying all these other techniques. So I have to teach myself how to be a wholesome painter instead of just thinking of myself as an oil painter. But anyways, I'm going to inevitably compare them to oil paint, but I think that in that comparison, I'm going to be able to also understand the things that they have to offer. I talked about this on past days during this week, but the important part is not to let oil paint just cast such a big shadow on, all these other wonderful techniques that we only see them as faulty, that we see them as frustrating because they stray away from what we understand is perfect painting, which is oil painting. During the weeks that I try to either reintroduce myself to something that I sort of know, like gouache paint, or introduce myself to something that I don't know, like these water mixable oils, I try to be open. I try to teach myself to be receptive to everything that's good about them and everything that they have to offer. This is not easy. I have to say it. Even though recognizing those things, it's a very important first step, it's not easy at all. And by the end of the week, we might recognize those attributes, but it doesn't mean that we're going to be able to put them to use. That would be absurd. And again, only extraordinary people can actually make that adjustment and on the fly produce some amazing paintings. I think that those are cases that we should admire, like I said with Nick and James. But I think that in my case, it's like trudging. I always describe painting like being slowly swallowed up by this very dense, muddy swamp. So it's always labor for me. It's always tough. Every single time I set up to paint, I have this faith that everything is going to go well, that everything is going to go smoothly. And the truth is, painting is always nightmarish. It's always tough. Always, always tough. It always keeps you on your toes. The moment you take your eyes off the ball, the moment you just lack that concentration that you need, your painting just goes all over the place. I mean, you could take a left turn and your painting is headed towards Scrape It Down City, because that's how painting is. This being the last day and judging back what has been this week of water mixable oil paints, even though I think I've recognized those very basic things, because remember, we're working on very raw basic features of this paint. Even though I think I recognize them, it's still very hard for me to just put them to good use, for me to say, okay, I'm actually taking full advantage of these particular water mixable oil paints. You guys have been awesome in the comments here and on my Instagram page, suggesting that there are other brands like Holbein brands and the Cobra paints that are perhaps a little bit better than these Winsor Newtons. I'm pretty positive that there must be other paints that are of higher quality. Like I said on Monday, these are the ones that I found at an art store. We don't usually get paints like these, so I thought it was pretty special, to have these readily available and to be able to find my whole palette. By my whole palette, and somebody was asking yesterday, I mean titanium white, even though it's not a fast-drying titanium white. Come on, Winsor Newton, start producing a fast-drying white in all of your paints. We need it. I need it, at least. So it's titanium white, yellow ochre, cad red, alizarin, raw umber, and ultramarine blue. That's my base palette. I love that palette. I could die with that palette. I don't need anything else. Even that palette could become actually smaller, and I would be totally fine. But it was surprising for me to find these colors. And as soon as I saw them and I saw that they were cheap, honestly, they were about $4 or $5 each. I thought they were fine. I thought they were perfectly fine. At that price point, I was like, yeah, sure, I'll take a chance. Because trust me, even though I may be able to afford some things now that I wasn't able to afford when I was younger, I still have that sentiment inside of me which says, I don't know, painting can be incredibly expensive. I mean, infinitely expensive if you want it to be. And it's us. It depends on us if we want to make it this horribly, almost inaccessible practice, or if we want to make it the most commonplace practice of all, where you feel comfortable with any substrate, with any paper, any bit of canvas, with any paint, with any medium. I've always tried to teach myself that. I think that that comes from, yes, me living here in Bogota, where, we have to be happy with the things that we can get here, but also because I taught probably hundreds of students throughout the years. And you can't expect every single student to spend a lot of money buying a ton of art materials. You can't. That is unrealistic and unfair. And many times students would tell me, and they would feel bad about it. They would tell me, I know we're supposed to do this exercise using a full palette, but I can only afford these colors and I can only afford these 2 brushes. And I was like, those are totally fine. Those are completely fine. The last thing I would ever do is to tell people, oh, that's horrible paint. I mean, sometimes I did encounter moments where I was shocked at how bad some paint was, particularly some paint that's produced locally. I want to believe that I can use any bit of paint that is put in front of me. But sometimes, oh my God, you buy something that says burnt sienna and you open it and it's just a black orange. It's just tubed chaos. So sometimes, those cheaper paints, those very cheap paints are very difficult to use. But I'm sure that if that's all we had to use, we would make the best of it. We would make lemonade. So I've always tried to teach myself to see possibilities, not obstacles, but opportunities to take advantage of whatever it is those materials offer to me. So I think I did that during this week. I tried to be flexible enough, malleable enough to say, okay, these are the things that are very different. Like I said, drying times, handling, the effect that the modified safflower oil has on the rest of the paint makeup, on the pigment plus that linseed oil, that has to be something relevant to this paint. And I feel that those things manifest themselves probably in an exaggerated manner when used with a raw surface that absorbs and separates paint. So I think that that's my first diagnosis of how this paint actually differs a bit. I'm totally fine with pigments not being as saturated or pigments not having the ability to have a very nice, rich contrast range. Totally fine with that. That's really no problem. I think, again, it accommodates really nicely to my love of gray muted painting. So I'm never going to feel like it's a real obstacle to try to exhibit, my intent. Speaking about substrates, today I changed up the paper. I was speaking yesterday at the end of the video that I was going to change up my paper, my surface. So as a small recap, on Monday, I used a Hanemula paper. Hanemula paper is very, very good paper. I would even say because it has a bit more fiber and it absorbs a little bit more than the Moleskine art sketchbook paper, I may like it a little bit more than the Moleskine paper. Moleskine paper is fantastic. I mean, it truly is a multimedia paper. It's not great for watercolor, I would say, but I've seen people do watercolor sketching in that art sketchbook and, in more capable hands than mine, they do terrific stuff. But I would say that for acrylic, gouache, casein, oil paint, it's just fantastic. Moleskine is just fantastic. And because Hanemula doesn't have that plate finish, kind of hot pressed finish that Moleskine has, it does feel a little more absorbent and it's very, very nice. So those are 2 nice papers that you could totally use for painting. So I used the Hanemula on Monday. Then Tuesday through Thursday, I used the Artist Loft watercolor paper. Now I mentioned this paper on Wednesday and I mentioned how people usually give this paper really bad reviews. This paper has a really bad rap. And I can imagine why it's considered a terrible substrate. You can really feel the fibers of this paper. I'm guessing that, when people buy it and they think that it's going to behave like traditional watercolor paper, they're surprised because this is raw paper. So those fibers that are right there are going to suck all your paint. It doesn't matter if it's acrylic, oils, watercolor. It really absorbs paint very, very quickly. So I'm guessing if people tend to overwork those fibers, then those wet fibers that are full of paint are just going to clump up and you're going to be picking up paper fiber as you're trying to paint. It makes total sense when you see the paper. If you buy this paper and if you are annoyed by that and if you feel like you wasted the $5 that this pad costs because it's very inexpensive. Just as a tip, buy rabbit skin glue and just make a solution and then brush it on your paper, and that way you seal it. And I guarantee that that paper is going to behave like other more traditional watercolor paper. So if you do have that paper lying around, it's very, very cheap, inexpensive paper. Get a hold of some rabbit skin glue. I'm not sure of the ratio of the solution that you should use to seal paper, particularly watercolor paper, but let's say it's 10 to 1. 10 parts water, 1 part rabbit skin glue. Use a double boiler, and as soon as that melts, you can apply it warm with a brush, just a single layer, and you're good. I think that paper is going to behave more like traditional watercolor paper. That would be my guess. I haven't done it, but I've used very pulpy paper in the past, and I've used traditional sized watercolor paper before. And, sizing paper is a very easy way to just seal it when it is a bit too absorbent. So I promise you this paper is not hopeless. So that's the paper I used for those 3 days. And today I went back to moleskin paper. I really, really like moleskin paper. You guys know this already, but it bears repeating. I am brand agnostic. We don't get stuff sent to us except Pink Pig. Those guys, it's a small company. It's a small British company. Those mates produce some incredible paper, and they were super kind one time to send me a bunch of paper, and it's extraordinary paper. They do a really, really great job. And I love, local. I'm not in the UK, obviously, but I love Liverpool. Go Reds. So I'm always going to consider those small companies as quote unquote local companies. So I always tell people, just support those local companies that are doing a good job. Both Danny and I believe that when we are speaking about something, it's so nice to not be beholden to anything, where if you buy a very expensive brush, you can actually say, yeah, these are not good. Or when you buy a very cheap brush, you could say, yeah, these are excellent. We're going to always be as honest as we can be with you guys. And I think that there's value to that. So moleskin paper I've used for years. I've bought 100% of all the moleskin sketchbooks that I've ever owned. And I think it's fantastic paper. So today we're working on that paper. It certainly does feel different than the Artist Loft watercolor paper. I'm guessing because it has a plate finish, paper is not as absorbent as the raw watercolor paper, but it's obviously still going to be absorbent. It let me handle paint a little bit more, so the paint layer just felt a little more open. And I think that because this is the 5th day and I got used to paint handling, I realized that I can make up for the kind of squishy, tacky quality of that paint if I put enough paint down. If I put a lot of paint down, I can actually make up for the gumminess and the tackiness. So that's what I did for this profile painting of Fed, which, by the way, when I was painting it, I was reminded of a Krøyer painting of Anna Ancher. I thought I would mention Krøyer. I thought, today is a great day to speak about Krøyer. He's probably the greatest 19th century, early 20th century Danish painter. But Anna Ancher got into my brain, and I was like, no, it's actually cool if we speak a little bit about Anna Ancher. Anna Ancher was part of this super talented group of painters of a region that's called Skagen. She was actually the only native Skagen painter. And because she was the only native painter, she was able to speak more profoundly and perhaps more genuinely about Skagen culture. And Anna was not quite representative of the women of Skagen, which were basically very religious. They were the wives of fishermen. A lot of these fishermen would go to sea. A bunch of them would never return. And she was able to tap into a lot of those roles that identified Skagen women at the end of the 19th century. And what's fascinating about her is that despite of that somber, almost paused, suspended in time quality of Skagen women, she was able to produce these paintings that are almost eerie. I mean, she started as what you would expect would be a naturalist painter in the late 19th century, which is very earthy, somewhat classical. Think about the beginnings of Van Gogh and how he transitioned to the latter use of color that he had in his paintings. But with Anna Ancher, she started with that traditional, very earthy palette. And then very quickly, in a span of 10 years, she moved to a more impressionist, post-impressionist portrayal of light. And it's fascinating. The color in her, like I said, it's very eerie. She many times speaks about the filtering of sunlight or dappled light. But it's almost like, I don't know how to explain it. I mean, in my brain, it's almost like if Gwen John, which is one of the most beautiful gray painters ever in history, it's almost as if Gwen John was painting with more saturated color and was suddenly a lot more sensitive to all these hues that are available when you try to grasp sunlight. So I think Anna Ancher was just a tremendous painter. I mean, there's something different about her paintings. It's almost ineffable. It's something that I can't put my finger on it because I don't see anything specifically extraordinary about her painting. It's not like she has this one painting that is absolutely incredible and that's how you measure her. You know, you realize that she's capable of producing that sort of painting. Not really. All her paintings just seem commonplace, but there's something underneath that makes them feel so peculiar, so her. I guess that's one of the things that you can only understand up to some point when you're looking at painting. Our instinct, it's always to try and grasp something. You know, as humanity, we want to grasp it, we want to hold it, and we want to try and understand it, like rationally make sense of it. But sometimes things are just meant to be experienced and celebrated, and it's not about, you know, fully comprehending what is underneath there and trying to then emulate that. I think she's just this quiet, extraordinary painter. It's almost like you have to look at her paintings for a long time and they will just eventually open up and you'll see this wealth of knowledge and sensitivity in them. It's so funny how, you know, this portrait of Fer reminded me of Krøyer painting Anna Ancher. So when I saw the painting, I was like, yeah, this actually feels a little bit like a young Anna Ancher painted by Krøyer. And I don't paint like Krøyer. I mean, for God's sakes, no, of course not. I mean, Krøyer was absolutely incredible. But what I'm saying is that because I have that imagery in my brain, it took me to Anna Ancher, and I was so happy that I opened up that book and I started reflecting upon her work because she is quite extraordinary. Those are the trips we can take with very simple daily exercises. So I think that when we can do that, we can feel okay with a day's worth of work. This was a wholesome day. So that's going to be it for today. Next week, I have another interview in the oven. I'm not going to spoil it for you guys, but it's a really cool artist friend of mine that I respect enormously. And I think we're going to leave that for not next week, but for the week after that. And maybe next week we're going to have a whole new theme that is very different from everything that we've done up to now. And I think it could be super exciting. So as we say on Fridays, both Danny and I thank you for letting us serve you. We are super happy to be given the chance to be your company for 20 minutes every day. So thank you guys for your support. We'll see you next week. Bye.